Well, listen, this video that I just put up on Saturday night seems to have caused an awful lot of questions that come back from many of you. And there is one comeback that seems to be coming up over and over again. That concerns my statement that I made there about the dialects, the dialectical differences in the 7th century. One particularly I want to use as a standard, and this is the one that by Richard O'Keefe. Let me just read what Richard, if you're listening, Richard, you know where I'm going with this. He says, before you make another video on this subject, consult an expert in the historic Semitic linguistics. Start by reading his 2012 paper, and he goes and gives me where it is, about automatically detecting modern dialects in written Arabic. And Richard, I went and I looked at it, and the problem with that is he's talking about modern Arab dialects. Do you see the difficulty? Modern Arab dialects, yes, do follow these rasm and also dialectic rules, but that's modern. We're not talking about modern. Remember, I'm always telling people, get back to the very beginning. We need to talk about the 7th century. I'm not interested in the 20th century. I'm not interested in the 21st century. I'm not even interested in the 9th and 10th century Arabic. I'm interested in 7th century. So that didn't help. And he goes on and says, among today's dialects, again, today, there are differences in morphology, vocabulary, and sentence structure that would have shown up in the early writing system. You certainly don't need the short vowels to discriminate dialects today. Whether long vowels are necessary is not discussed in that paper. According to the Ecology of Arabic, a study of Arabization, the variety of himyar contain the verbal suffix for the k for the first and second letters of the persons of the verb, and since k is not any kind of vowel, at least that dialect difference would have shown up in the old writing system. And here again, the old writing system, we're going to get back to that, but I'm going to show you that is wrong. That, in fact, a lot of this has now been completely erased since 2017. I'll show you why. Hold on a minute. The Wikipedia entry lists 5 dialects, modern dialects, with many but not all differences mentioned there being vowels, yet some of the difference would show up in pre-consonantal text. So please, a moratorium on claims that you can't tell the difference between Arabic dialects without the vowels until you have checked with scholars whether it's true. Thanks for that. I'm not a scholar, O'Keefe, in this area, so I wanted to go back to the scholars, and I went to Dr. Mark Dury and his book on this. This is, I don't know if you've got it, you've got to do it. This is part of his doctoral thesis. Dr. Mark Dury is a linguist. He has 2 doctorates, one in linguistics and the other in Islam. So he knows Arabic, especially the Arabic language. Now, what he says, and it's fascinating because he is referring and he quotes Al-Jalad. Al-Jalad, who's a scholar who has gone back to the earliest Arabic dialect that we can come with. He's the first one to actually have written about it in 2015 and also in 2017. And what Al-Jalad does, he shows that in some ways everything that we're talking about is a non sequitur. What dialect are we talking? What is this Qurayshi dialect? Let's just start with that. What is this Qurayshi dialect? The Qurayshi dialect was from, according to the traditions from the 9th and 10th century, this is the dialect that they spoke in Mecca in the 7th century. Are you following that? So the Qurayshi are a group, is a family, a tribe within Mecca. They lived in Mecca, according to the traditions. Now, there was no Mecca to begin with, so that's a historical problem. But I want to see what this dialect that Uthman is asking them to speak. What is this dialect that is in a written form that he is asking them to go to? And of course, this is where Al-Jalad picks up this theme. And what he does, he looks at the Arabic that existed at that time in the 7th century, and he looks at pre-Islamic, so pre-7th century Arabic, and he says that there was no such thing as any dialect of a written Arabic. There was no dialect or any written Arabic in that part of the world, in that part of Central Arabia, known as the Hijaz, where Mecca and Medina are located. What he notices and what he notes is this. He looks at 4 areas, he looks at 4 things. He looks at the final unstressed inflection vowels, the Irab rhyme schemes. Secondly, he looks at what we know as the Ta Marbuta, which is in Arabic. If you know Arabic, you know what I'm referring to. He looks at the Alif Maksura, and then he looks at the definite article, those four areas, and he shows that in every case, that which you find in the Quran with those four Arabic grammatical, consonantal, and grammatical reference points, in every case, these only existed in what they call the Southern Levant. The Southern Levant includes Israel, includes Palestine, and includes Jordan. So this Arabic that we have in the Quran, the Arabic that you see in the Quran here, was from the northern areas, 600 miles further north. This is from the Southern Levant. This is from Jordan. This is the Nabatean script that amalgamated with the Aramaic to create the Arabic we have today. So this Arabic that we're talking about is not even from Mecca. Let me just show you what his conclusions were. And this is Dr. Mark Dewey's conclusions, and this is what he says. The Quran, the 7th century, if it was 7th century, he's not even speculative of that, was composed and first recited in a dialect very close or identical to the variety in which the spelling of the razm became fixed. This was most likely Nabatean Arabic dialect, that is, the dialect of Palestina, Tertia. The orthography for Arabic is known to have been developed from the Nabatean Aramaic. The Quran was originally recited in the Arabic of settled areas in the Southern Levant. And that's on page 17. Looking on page 18, it is to be quite sure about it that the clear Arabic in which the Quran was first recited, remember, now we're talking about recitation, was not the native dialect of Mecca. Later, the modifications in pronunciation imposed upon the razm by the extensive use of diacritics again, that's what we've been talking about, the diacritics, which are the dots and the vowelization, served the grammarians' desire to conform Quranic recitation so what they considered was the gold standard, namely Bedouin speech. This then is another kind of evidence that decouples the Quran from Mecca and the life of Muhammad. So this whole, in some ways, this whole discussion we're having is moot when you start looking and do a historical survey of the Arabic itself. The Arabic we're talking about is not from Mecca to begin with. So where is this Qurayshi dialect? But I wanted to also go and find out exactly what the Arab speakers are saying, so I wanted to go and ask Al-Fadi, a good friend of mine. You all know Al-Fadi. He's worked with me for quite a while now. I wanted to see what he thought about it because he does speak Arabic fluently. I read and write it, but I don't speak it. I've had 2 years of Arabic, so who am I? I'm white, and I'm an American. So who am I? I'm not an authority. But he would be. In fact, he is doing his doctoral thesis on this very area. So I asked him to come on last night, and so we recorded what I'm going to show you now. And this, sit back and look and see, because he's going to answer your question from an Arab standpoint, a Saudi Arabian Arab standpoint, not a Indian who comes from Gujarat or comes from anywhere from India, who lives in Toronto, from his standpoint. We're going to talk and see what the Arabs are saying about this very question. So sit back, let's see what came out. This is Jay, then, with my good friend Al-Fadi just last night. Well, good evening. As you can see, I have my good friend Al-Fadi. Al-Fadi, we've known each other for quite a while now, haven't we?
Thank God, absolutely.
It's so good to have you back on board again. I'm sorry you've had a very busy day. You've preached already twice this morning. You've also done an entire broadcast, and you still have more yet to do tonight. But thanks for coming on, because what I want to do, and you're the Arab expert, and you're the one that understands the way that the Arabic text is written. And one of the difficulties that we're coming up with, and people are starting to object to in the videos I put up this last week, concerns dialects, Arabic dialects, and how they are written in an Arabic text. So dialects are basically different ways to say the same thing. And you have dialectic differences in different locations, so geographical locations. So you are from Saudi Arabia. The way you would read, or the way you would speak your Arabic, would be different than, say, someone in Tunis or someone in Egypt or someone up in Jordan. Am I correct?
That is correct. That is correct. And I want to say one more thing, Jay. Yes, sometimes it's the same word, you pronounce it differently, but there are occasions where you have to use a different word to describe the same thing. But I know you're not talking about that right now.
No, and the reason I'm bringing this up, and the reason why this has caused a little bit of consternation, has to do with Al-Bukhari. I brought up Al-Bukhari. This is really the only place that Muslims can go to. It's the best place. It's not the only, but it's certainly the place where they go to find out what and how the Quran was actually written. And
Right.
according to Al-Bukhari, volume 6, 509 and 510, these two that I have here, you have, in this case, this is the 632 edition of the Quran. This is the one that was compiled by Abu Bakr. It wasn't compiled by him. He gave authority to Zayd ibn Thabit to compile it between 632 634. And then this side, this paper, the next hadith, then goes into 652. So we're talking about 20 years between these two papers. In this case,
Right.
you have Uthman then, who has Zayd ibn Thabit once again, along with three others, Zubair, Alas, and Hisham, to rewrite it in the Qurayshi dialect. And that's what we want to zero in on today, because people are concerned that I made the statement yet last night when I put up the video that in order to read it in a dialect, in a Arabic script, so and actually read it, not say it, but to read it on a script, you need to have help. And that help was not there in the 7th century. And that helps are the dots and the vowels. Can you add to that, or take away that, or explain what I mean by that as an Arab?
Well, I mean, if you put a word and using the Quranic language, rasm, the rasm of Uthman, what does that mean? A rasm meaning you have the letters, and these letters will give you the shape of how the word would look like.
Yeah.
And what was discovered at the time of Uthman, which is the tradition you alluded to, is that some people, at least north in Iraq and in Syria at that time, were not pronouncing things correctly, or at least in the mind of the military leader, they were not doing it correctly. Why? Because he heard it one way and he's hearing some others reading it another way. And he came to Uthman, as you know, and he told Uthman that there is contention between the soldiers. And he was concerned I'm paraphrasing.
Let me read it. Let me just read what you've just said.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Hudayfa was afraid of that's the people from Sham, which is Syria and Iraq, differences in the recitation of the Quran. So he said to Uthman, O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the book, as the Jews and Christians did before. So he comes and he says, we've got to do something here because the recitations are different.
Correct. And the recitations are different, meaning that the pronunciation of these words are different. So some of the soldiers are accusing the others of doing heretical readings. That's basically what it boils down to. You're not reading it correctly. You're not reading it as it was revealed. We memorized it this way. You're not reciting it that way.
Mhm.
Now, that right there is a classic example of how different dialects can cause different sounds of the word and possibly even different meanings in some cases.
Right. And Shabir Ali, in his video, he mentioned this, that if you have too many people from all over the place saying it a different way, the words can be pronounced so much so that sooner or later there are going to be differences. And that's what we're talking about. That's all that's going on here. These are the difference in the way they said it. Nothing more. But then remember, he has to go back to volume 6, 510, because it says then that that's Uthman, sent a message to Hafsa, send us the manuscript. So this is nothing recitation now. This is a paper. Manuscript, or in this case, it would be animal skin. Manuscript of the Quran, so that we may compile the Quranic materials in perfect copy. So now we're not talking about recitation. Am I correct?
That's right. So we have an exemplar, and supposedly copyists are copying from something.
And this is the 632 one that this refers to. Now, this is the one we were talking about. So the 632 is, give me this one that you did way back in 632, 20 years later. Now bring that copy, Hafsa, the daughter of Umar, she kept it under her bed. Now bring me that copy. And now what is he going to do? Make it into perfect copies, plural, and return the manuscript to Hafsa once you have finished. Okay. So that's okay. We're not talking about recitation anymore. Now we're talking about a manuscript.
And something that will be read for sure. Yes,
okay.
Because they're making copies of it.
Okay, that's what he says. So he he had these four were that he was giving them, they were commissioned to do that. And then he said to them to rewrite the manuscripts. Again, this is not recitation. This is nothing to do with readings. It's to rewrite them. Rewrite. You write something on a vellum, on a piece of parchment, on a piece of papyrus. In this case, it would be vellum or parchment, animal skin. In perfect copies. However, he says, in case you disagree with Zayd ibn Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it, not recite it, not recitate it, write it in the dialect of the Quraysh.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about dialect of Quraysh. Help us here. Al-Fadi, unpack that. What does that say to you?
Well, it says one of two things, obviously. To write it in a specific dialect, for in this case, we're going to use the Qurayshi dialect. That means there are words that will be pronounced in a very specific way, which means you have to use dotting and diacritical markations to help those in Syria, those in Iraq who do not know the Qurayshi dialect to be able to pronounce it correctly.
Okay, back up again. What did you just say? You have to use what? What is it?
Diacritical markings to help you pronounce it correctly.
Define what you mean by diacritical markings.
It's basically the markations you put above or below the letters or at the beginning or at the end to help you say the word appropriately.
All right.
You
Does
know,
that also
so
include vowels?
sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It depends. But
Okay.
technically speaking, you still need the guide of these diacritical markations to help at least the one who's going to read it to you. Even someone comes back and say, well, they were memorizing it. That's fine. But who was reading it to them in the Qurayshi dialect? They still have to know how to say it in a Qurayshi dialect. That's where we are dealing with. That's one theory. The second theory could be that you write certain words and how the Qurayshi said something about a specific noun or a place or whatever. You use that particular designation for it because that's how the Qurayshis would have said it.
All right.
Now we're dealing with a whole different ballgame here because maybe the people in Iraq wouldn't say the same way, describe the same thing in the exact same word. And we have incidences of this, by the way, that other words are used as a synonym for something or other words completely different to describe something. But I'm going to try to simplify it and stick just with the way the letters are written. The rasm, the structure is still the same, but you have to pronounce it differently.
All right. Now
You need guidance for that.
you're becoming an expert in the Sana'a manuscript. This is the area that this is the document. This is the manuscript that you're studying.
That's correct.
And when you look at the Sana'a manuscript, I'm just going to put a picture of it right here. We're going to put a picture of it. You can see it. Here's a picture of the Sana'a manuscript. Do you see any of those diacritical marks in this manuscript?
You know, there is a handful only, and there is even a debate about whether this was put by the writer of the first layer or the writer of the second layer, or if it was somebody that came later and tried to even do that.
Okay, looking at this manuscript here, I'll put it up again. Here we are, we're putting it up again. When you look at these letters here, you who are a modern Arab, who reads modern Arabic, you are dependent on having dots above and below the line, the noon, the ta, the tha, the ba, the ya. You also are dependent on having the dama, the kasr, and the fatha, the vowels, to be able to know exactly how to pronounce these different words. Am I correct?
That's correct. But in general, you're not going to find this, at least in the lower layer and most of the upper layer. You're not going to still find these marcation systems in there in the Sana'a manuscript.
Why not?
Well, initially, that's how the manuscripts of the Quran were written. And it was a later system that came and began to invent ways. Sometimes they put certain dots. It could be a couple of dots, in a certain location to help you pronounce this letter this way or that way. Later on, they start to use colored dots, to help you even pronouncing it. And so that system continued to evolve until we get to what we call today the diacritical markations of fatha, dhamma, kasra, shadda, all that kind of stuff.
And when that happened, then you had many different ways of putting dots. Dots could go you had many different varieties and different categories, which would change the word, would they not, depending on where the dots go?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the projects that I was involved in called the Quran Dilemma, in that book, you will see that there was a table using a very simple rasm. That rasm has 3 letters only. By the way you change the dotting locations, just the dotting, the word could become bait, meaning house, bint, meaning daughter, Bennett, now it's a verb, she built, Nebat, meaning that basically grew out like a plant. I mean, I think if my memory is right, it took about 30 plus examples of the same rasm just by the dottings itself.
I'm just going to put up one right here. Just take a look at this. Here are 19 different ways of saying just the same thing with 3 letters. Now, let me just go on. So this is the case. This would all have come together in about the 8th or 9th century, what you're talking about now, when you had many different derivations of the same word, now that the dots were in place. And that's why you had many different students and you had many different scholars who were then trying to decide how the Quran should be read depending on where the dots were. Am I correct?
That's correct.
And this is coming, we're talking about late 8th century. And one of those was a fellow named Hafs, who was from Iraq, who died in 796, so late 8th century. He had his way of putting these dots. And there were about, we're guessing right now we're up to 37 of these. So 36 others who had them differently than he had it in 5 different cities. In the late 8th century, early 9th century. We're not talking about the 7th century anymore. We're not talking about the 7th century. We're talking about the 8th and 9th century. It is in the 8th and 9th century then that you get all these different ways of pronouncing the word in a written text, these different dialects and these different ways of saying it. And that takes place in the 8th and 9th century. And that's why we have the whole schools of Qira'at and Ahruf, of knowing which are the difference, how they're different, who is better, which is a better way of understanding. And you have all these discussions that have been going on for 1,000 years until in 1924, they finally chose Hafs as the one that they're going to go with. So Hafs is really, we're only talking about diacritical and also Qira'at in Ahruf reading. Am I correct?
That is correct, but also they chose one of the traditions of Hafs, because there is a couple of traditions of Hafs anyway.
I think that's something 7 different Hafs, what you last told me.
And what I want to say, you hit on something interesting. Like we're no longer dealing with the 7th century. That's true. 8th and 9th century, but even when these 7 ahruf qira'at by Ibn Mujahid were canonized, let's use that term, that was 10th century. So they were much.
Ibn Mujahid is 936, so he's way even further. He's after Al-Bukhari. He's after these.
Right. That's right.
After Al-Tabari. So we're taking 936. That's 10th century. He is the one that says there's 7, right?
He's the one who decided which 7, actually. In fact, there is work by an Arab speaker, Dr. Shadi Nasser, who did his dissertation on the transmissions of the Quran, basically, and the difference between canonized and shadh, which is like heretical. And he focused on this tradition, and I liked his conclusion that he really is skeptical about the fact that this tradition even existed during the time of Muhammad. But I don't want to put words in his mouth. Technically speaking, he would prove to you in his research that this is a later, basically, decision that was made by Ibn Mujahid to choose 7 out of the many readings that existed in his days.
In fact, can we not say that everything we know about this idea of 7 readings, 10 readings, 14 readings, I mean, it goes on and on, all of them come from the 10th century and later?
That's right, because after Ibn Mujahid's 7 ahruf or 7 qira'at, Ibn al-Jazri added 3 more. Now we have the 10 readings, which is, many people know about them, by the way. In fact, there is a recent book that's just been published, translated them in English, actually. But then there were 4 more that were added later, and they decided, exactly, they decided anything past the 14 is heretical. And I'm saying, who decides this? Which way the Quran was revealed in the first place?
In his video said this was all happening in the 7th century. This was happening while Muhammad was still living. It was Muhammad that said that there were 7 readings.
Well, with all due respect to Shabir Ali, he needs to do his homework well.
Yeah, this has been great. This has been fun. But I want to just do, before we go any further, I want to just talk about one thing that we forgot to talk about. This Qurayshi dialect, right?
That's what the tradition says.
All right. The tradition says in 509, this one here, this is 509. In 509, Abu Bakr had Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary of Muhammad, write it down for the first time. That's the first recension. Now, I have no doubt that what he wrote down was the Qurayshi dialect, because he's from the Qurayshi tribe. And he is the secretary of Muhammad. He would have been with him in Mecca and Medina. So therefore, I'm assuming that the very first recension was Qurayshi to begin with. Just help me there. Would you disagree or agree with me on that?
That's what the tradition even says, that Uthman instructed Zayd, if there is a disagreement, to write it in the Qurayshi.
You're jumping ahead. I'm
No,
talking
what
about
I'm saying, it sounds like it was revealed in the Qurayshi in the first place.
Well, I'm going to question that right now because this must have been written in the Qurayshi dialect to begin with. If this is the first recension, if this is the one that he wrote because of the fact that he was a secretary of Muhammad, 20 years later in 652, now we're on this sheet now, we've come to this ayat. This is Uthman's times. 20 years afterwards, he takes the same guy, Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary of Muhammad, who I'm assuming is a Qurayshi himself, as was Muhammad, I'm not the Hashim. Is it Hashim? The Hashim. He's a Hashim.
The tribe, yeah, of Hisham. Yes,
Subgroup of the Quraysh was the
Beni Hashim. I'm sorry, you're talking about Beni Hashim. Yes,
Beni Hashim. So he's from the Beni Hashim tribe. So his secretary, I'm assuming, would be from the same dialect place because he comes from the same place that Muhammad comes from. So the same guy in both 632 and 652, Uthman then says to him, if you have any disagreement, write it in the Qurayshi dialect. Hold on, wasn't it already written in the Qurayshi dialect?
You would think, because that's what Uthman says. His reasoning was, if there is a disagreement, you write it in the Qurayshi because that's how it was revealed. So right there is a cue here. Uthman is saying it was revealed in the first place in the Qurayshi, which really begs the question. If it was revealed in the Qurayshi, why the need for different readings anyway?
Bingo. Thank you so much, Al-Fadi. And can you then understand what I think? Now, this is me speaking. I think this proves once again that this was all coming from the mind of Al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari in the 9th century, who died in 870, so between 850 and 870, he is the one that's redacting this back to the 7th century. He's redacting it back here to the 7th century, and he's assuming that this was a problem back then. That's why he claimed you must write it in the Qurayshi dialect. Because in the 7th century, when this is all taking place, Al-Bukhari, who's here in the 9th century, knew that this would be a problem in the 9th century. But he wasn't thinking through. There was no way that you could write it in a Qurayshi dialect any different than it had already been written, because you did not have these diacritical marks and you didn't have these vowelizations that early. Are you following me on this?
That's true. I mean, it seemed like it was redacted backward to try to prove a point of something that you have later, as if it has a sound origin. And that's where the problem is. I mean, anytime you rely on any hadith of Bukhari, regardless of what the hadith is dealing with, in this case, we're dealing with the transmission of the Quran, you are automatically putting yourself in a tough position because you have to prove now someone who came 240 years after the time of Muhammad did have eyewitness or have even sound isnad that can prove to him what he has in his hand is truly what the Prophet uttered. And we know from the collection of hadith that Bukhari himself was disturbed by the fact that he collected 660,000. Most of them were actually corrupt, and he settled with 7,000 that even include some repetitions.
Okay. Now, Al-Fadi, I don't want to take up any more of your time. You've done us a great favor. But before we go, what I'd like to do is, you've asked that we do this. I'd like to give some examples. I'm going to put up 2 examples of difference between Hafs and other writings, and we're going to look at these and show why this is important. And so, because an awful lot of what we've been saying in the last number of minutes is very technical, and for a lot of people who are watching, they don't understand Arabic. You do. I can read and write it. I don't understand it like to speak it. But you read, write, and speak it, and you come from the same place that the Prophet came from. So you speak from the same dialect, I'm assuming, that he would have spoken if this were all true. So I'm going to share a screen here, and I'm going to put up these 2 slides here so people can see them. And I want you to describe what we're looking at here and why this is significant. Okay, this is Surah 43:19. Can you see what I see?
Yes.
Okay, explain that. Now, on one side is the Hafs, on the other side is the Ra. These are 2 of the 37 that we now have, that Hatu now has in London. So Hafs is the standard one that we use today. Ra is another from another rendition, again, from the late 8th century.
That's right. So here's what we're seeing. Even though the rasm, the shape of the word, to even a naked eye, somebody who doesn't know Arabic, might look the same, it's the dotting and diacritical markings that will help you now pronounce it correctly, and even the meaning will be appropriate. So here you can see how by adding simple dottings and diacritical markings, the meaning of the whole word changed completely. For instance, in Hafs, the word reads slaves of Allah. Ibadur Rahman, slaves of Allah. Okay, so saying that the angels here are the slaves of Allah, his servants. Fine. But then in the second one, Rawh, the same shape, by changing the diacritical markings and the dottings, it is not read the same. It is saying that those slaves are in the presence of Ar-Rahman, عند الرحمن.
Buddy, for those of you who are uninitiated, look at the left side. Look where the green line is below it. And can you see the dot is below the letter? The dot is a ba. That's ibadu. So there you can see the dot is below. When you go over to the right side where the yellow mark is, can you see the red word there? That's inda. And there the dot's above the letter.
That's
so
new.
One is a ba, the one is a na. It changes the letter completely depending on where you put the dot. That's what we've been talking about.
Exactly. So it's totally different to describe somebody to be a slave of Allah, Ibadur Rahman or Abdur Rahman. Let's just, for example, to say that the person is in the presence of Allah. Big difference. Now, somebody might come back and say, well, the angels are in the presence of Allah. Well, are they always in the presence of Allah? Doesn't he send them places? Beside, which way the Quran was revealed? This way or that way?
And are those angels slaves, or are they simply in the presence? If I were a slave, if I were an angel, I'd rather be in the presence rather than be a slave. So
that's right. That's right.
Hugely significant. And also, if I were an angel, I would prefer being in God's presence, but also that I would prefer if only the slaves were made females and not me, thank you, since I'm a male. So you can see both ways. You've got two big problems here.
That's right. And you know, in Rawh reading, it looks like it's an indicative emphasizing that the presence of the angels is in the presence of Allah, meaning that tells me that the angels cannot go anywhere. They're always in the presence of Allah, basically.
Good stuff. Now we go to one more here. Let's go to this one here. This is Surah 98, verse 6. Go ahead. Help us with this one.
So here we have Hafs reading, which is on the left, and Warsh reading, which is on the right. Hafs, by the way, is the majority of the Quranic reading today. That includes the 1924 Cairo edition, versus Warsh, which is found in parts of North Africa. Now, here is the word also, without dottings, without diacritical markings. You can look at it and say, well, okay, it appears to look the same. That's the rasm. It looks the same. The structure looks the same. The only difference here is that in Hafs reading, it is saying, are we Christians the worst creatures, or are we innocent? I mean, here you're asking that question because the Quran is saying something interesting. It's saying, إن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين في نار جهنم خالدين فيها أولئك هم شر البرية. Meaning, it is saying that those people, the polytheists, according to the Quran, the people of the scripture are the worst of creatures. Sharrul Bariya. Al Bariya, that's the word that you're highlighting here. You have the green underlining. And in the second reading, it's saying they are the worst of the innocent. Al Bariya. Al Bariya. So it's indicating that humankind is innocent, but there are levels in there. Some are worse than others.
So that's a theological difference right there, isn't it?
It's a huge theological problem here, because you're assuming here or telling me that if I were to read it for the first time, if I'm somebody who doesn't know anything about the teaching of the Quran, I would say, well, that's interesting. The Quran is identifying humankind to be innocent. They have no basically fault for whatever they do.
Or in this case, the people of the scriptures are innocent.
That's right.
Then what if we're innocent? What are we doing in hell?
Well, just you happen to be the worst of innocent people.
I mean, you could just write papers on this one, and this is why when Shabadati said it didn't change one belief, it didn't change one practice, it didn't change one doctrine. Here is a huge change right here, proving that, and this is just one of now 93,000 that Hatun's team has found in London. She's found 93,000 of these. And only looking at 20 23 of the Qur'ans of the 37 that she now has. So you can see this is hugely significant. And that's why it's important that we do look at this. We do give some examples. And now all of that you have just done in the last 5 minutes by looking at those two, not even 5 minutes, just looking at those two slides, all of those changes requires dots and vowels.
Right. In order for you to read it, al-Bariya versus al-Bari'a. That was very simple. I mean, without it, you won't be able to pronounce it correctly. And notice, when you pronounce it correctly, now you know the meaning of the word. Al-Bari'a, innocent, al-Bariya, creatures. Big difference.
Al-Fadi, you've been a real blessing, and thank you so much. And I bless you that you have not only such a good mind, but that you're doing this kind of work. This is your doctoral thesis. This is part of what's going to be coming out in your doctoral thesis. You're going to be doing this. Now, as much as Muslims like Al-Shabir Ali want to say that these later qira'at do not change any meaning, any belief, any doctrine, we're going to show you that they do. We've just given you two examples real quickly. Wait till you see what we're going to show you later on. But I'm still glad that we still are asking every Muslim, and please, those Muslims who are watching us, we, in some ways, we're getting caught up again in the Qira'at and the Ahruf, which is over here. I would still like to get Muslims to help me with the 7th century. I'm still waiting for that manuscript that you're talking about. I'm still waiting for that complete manuscript of 114 surahs that Uthman sent to those 4 different cities, or maybe 9 cities, or some say it could be 7 cities. Nonetheless, show me one. I just want one manuscript that you claim that you can find that still exists today, that is complete, 114 surahs from the 7th century. That's my goal, because everything we're doing in this whole series is what existed in the 7th century. Did Muhammad exist in the 7th century? Did Islam exist in the 7th century? Were the people called Muslims in the 7th century? Was there any city called Mecca in the 7th century? And was there a Quran in the 7th century? So far, everything you're telling me, everything we're going to are 8th century and 9th century. I don't care. I don't really want to spend my time there. I want to find out what happened in the 7th century. So there's the elephant in the room. Please help me there. We're still waiting. Before we go, though, I just want to thank Al-Fadi. You've been a great guest. It's so good to always have you. I know you're exhausted. This has been a huge day. Thanks at the end of the day for coming and helping us out. God bless you.
Absolutely. My pleasure, brother, to serve. Thank you.
Okay. God bless you, all of you. Until next time, this is Jay. Over and out.